Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we're going to take a look at the movie Saving Private Ryan, specifically how the 1903 A4 sniper rifle is portrayed in the hands of Private Jackson in that movie. Now, I want to preface this video by saying that I really enjoyed Saving Private Ryan. It's a fantastic movie. There's an incredible amount of work that went into making it realistic and accurate, and there are some fantastic little details in there that most people will never even notice that are incredibly accurate and period appropriate. But there's also some problems, and when I went back and rewatched it with an eye specifically towards Private Jackson's sniper rifle, it was pretty bad. We first see Private Jackson on the assault craft heading to Omaha Beach. He's with us for the entirety of the movie. And if you notice, even in this very first scene, he's got a tube over his shoulder. That's a scope carrying tube, which is interesting because it tells me whoever put together the uniform and the equipment for Private Jackson definitely put some real thought into what they were doing. Unfortunately, they got it basically all wrong. So when we first see Private Jackson actually using his rifle, it is on the beach to take out a German machine gun nest. And in that scene, his rifle is a 1903 A4 set up with a small scope like this. However, unfortunately, what they actually gave him was a rifle that has a Lyman Alaskan scope on it. That was, as we touched on in my video on the 03 A4, the Lyman Alaskan was the scope that the US military wanted to have for these rifles, but they weren't actually available, and so they used the Weaver 330 instead. Now, if you look closely at Private Jackson's rifle, you will see that he has adjustment knobs up here just behind the front scope mount. That is a Lyman Alaskan. The actual scope, the Weaver 330, has its adjustment knobs, see it a little better over here, right back here, way at the very back of the scope. So even from the beginning, they've given him the right rifle. Note that the front sight is missing, as it is in the movie. That's correct. But not the right scope. And given the attention to detail in other aspects of the movie, I'm not sure why exactly this slipped through the cracks. Now, there were Lyman Alaskans that were retrofitted onto rebuilt 03 A4s after World War II. They did see some use in Korea, although the majority of them the vast majority of them, went on to M1C Garand snipers. But you would never have run into one of these rifles with a Lyman Alaskan in the European theater, or really anywhere in World War II. So that's our first problem. The next time that we see Private Jackson and his sniper rifle in the movie is where we have probably the biggest factual problem with how it's presented. That's the bell tower scene. So there's a German sniper up in a bell tower, shoots one of the Americans. Private Jackson figures out where he is, that's where I'd be, and estimates the range at 450 yards and decides that the scope that he's got on his rifle is insufficient for the task. And well, he's not necessarily wrong on that. It's a 2 3/4 power scope, pretty low magnification. And Jackson's solution is to go to that tube, I think it's on this shoulder, that he's had on his back the whole time. And by the way, that is appears to be correct, carrying case for an Unertl 8-power scope. And he pulls that thing out and sticks it on his rifle. Now, we have like 5 simultaneous problems here. First off, the Unertl was used as a scope on a World War II sniper, but it was the Marine Corps sniper rifle. And Private Jackson's not a Marine. There weren't any Marines at D-Day, which is kind of weird if you think about it. The biggest amphibious landing that had ever been done, and it didn't have any of the Marine Corps. But that's a separate issue. They were busy in the Pacific. Anyway, there are no Marines there. There are not going to be any Marine Corps sniper rifles there. It's just Private Jackson and his standard issue 1903 A4. The other problem here is that the mounting points for the Unertl are not the same as the mounting points for this guy. This has a front mounting point up here on the receiver. On the Unertl scopes, they actually mount a scope mounting block up here in the middle of the handguard, and the rifles have basically customized handguards that are cut away so that they can put a mounting point up on the front end of the rifle. They're also, for what it's worth, they're also 1903 standard rifles, not 03 A4s, so they actually have rear sights on them. The Marine Corps rifles have front sights on them. They're really, I mean, as much as two 1903-based sniper rifles can be different, those are substantially different sniper rifles. There is, in fact, no way that you can just swap this scope and the Unertl. It's physically impossible. and there weren't any Unertls there. So that's our biggest single issue of the movie, I think. Now, let's just accept at this point that, okay, Jackson has an Unertl 8-power scope on his rifle. Fine. Unfortunately, there are a couple more problems with how he's shown operating that scope. So the very first thing he does with it is he peeks up over some cover and goes to figure out where the shot's going to be and adjust his scope to make the shot. And what you see him doing is cranking on the front objective of the scope, which is adjustable on the Unertl. If you listen, you can hear him saying, 2 clicks windage. Well, the problem is he's not actually adjusting windage. What turning the front objective on that scope does is actually adjust parallax. This essentially is an adjustment to allow you to make sure that the reticle and the scope are focused on the same plane. Because if they're not, then if your eye is off center at all in the scope, the reticle is going to shift and your point of impact is going to change. So it is important, especially on an old school, fully adjustable scope like the Unertl, to set the parallax correctly. But that's not windage. The windage are the knobs on the top and the side of the scope that are mounted, well, here it's right there. On the Unertl, they're like right over here. Actually, they're on the front mount of the scope. In fact, if you look at this still frame of the Unertl scope, you can see that it doesn't have a mounting point out in front where a real Unertl would have one, and that's because they have to kludge it onto an 03A4 sniper rifle somehow. A bit later on in the film, when we see Jackson doing his own shooting from up in the bell tower, there was an opportunity for the filmmakers to have a really great piece of technically accurate detail. Well, it would have been assuming that the rifle was accurate to this setting, which it's not. But one of the interesting things about the Unertl scopes is in order to isolate them from recoil, because they were relatively early, relatively fragile scopes, they are actually not fixed in their rings. So when you fire a rifle with an Unertl scope on it, the scope actually moves forward. I mean, technically it doesn't. What's happening is the rifle moves backward. Inertia tends to hold the scope where it is, and so the result is the scope offsets forward on the rifle. Now, on the civilian versions, the competition and hunting versions of these scopes, there was a spring built into the scope and base system so that the scope would bounce forward and then the spring would push it back into position and reset it for your next shot. When the Marine Corps adopted these scopes on their 1903 A1 snipers, they decided to leave deliberately that spring out. And I think the idea was that it might get fouled or caught on stuff, or it was just extra complexity that they didn't necessarily want. So on the Marine Corps scopes, after each shot, the scope is offset forward, and the shooter has to physically pull it back against the stops on the mount to put it back in position to make the next shot. And of course, since this is a scope that is mocked up on a rifle that it's not actually appropriately suited for, it doesn't move. And I mean, at this point, I'm not surprised that it doesn't move, but I think it's worth pointing out that that's how the Unertl would have worked. And if there was a movie done that did portray a US Marine Corps sniper with one of these scopes on his rifle, that's how you would expect it. That if they wanted to be right, that's how they would do it. So those are our big primary issues with the rifle. There are a couple others which we don't need to get into in real detail because they're just oopsies. In one scene, the bolt is actually set for disassembly. That safety flag is lifted all the way up. In fact, interesting point of order, with a proper Weaver scope, you can't actually do that because that flag won't fit underneath the rear lens of the scope that way. Also, of course, Jackson fires more than 5 rounds without reloading the thing. Okay, fine, that's kind of a typical movie thing. In theory, maybe they cut and edit where he reloaded it, but those are less technical issues than the big ones. So, oh, and of course, Jackson's left-handed. So one of the things that I do see people complaining about when they're talking about the realism of the movie, Jackson's left-handed, so he's going to be holding the rifle like this. What he does in every scene is he'll fire, and then he will reach over the gun and cycle the bolt. Locks open when it's empty. Cycle the bolt like this. And you can actually see him struggling to do that in a couple of scenes. And people wonder, well, why didn't he shoot, frankly, the way that I typically shoot myself, which is to use my front hand, my right hand, to operate the bolt so that it's on the same side. And there honestly, there are good explanations both ways. If he had been using a shooting sling, which you do see him put on in one scene in the movie, this arm would essentially be wrapped up and tied to the rifle, and it's not practical to use it to cycle the bolt. So you would reach over with your left hand as a left-handed shooter. Frankly, I see that as less of a substantial issue. Honestly, it's kind of an interesting thing to see where, yeah, there were left-handed guys who were issued sniper rifles. How did they operate those things? And what Jackson does is a perfectly legitimate way to do it. U.S. Army snipers in World War II didn't have a whole ton of training. They certainly would not have had the sort of really detailed, in-depth training of how to properly, like, what's the most efficient way to operate the rifle and get it totally ingrained. They'd just be shooting the way they'd always normally shot. So if Jackson were a kid who grew up shooting left-handed on a farm, reaching over the rifle to cycle the bolt because it was easy without having a scope in the way, and then he just adapts that to a scope and has to struggle with it a little bit once he gets into the Army, that pretty well fits. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.